Some people disappear not because they have lost themselves, but because they can no longer find themselves inside the person everyone else recognizes. On a rainy Saturday evening in Portland, Hannah Reed stood beneath the warm lights of a crowded restaurant while 20 people sang around a birthday cake. She smiled at the right moment, leaned forward when someone spoke, and asked thoughtful questions that made each person feel important. To everyone in the room, Hannah was exactly who she had always been: calm, perceptive, generous, and quietly dependable. Yet as laughter rose around the table, she felt something inside her become completely still. She looked at the familiar faces and realized that every response she gave had been practiced for years. She knew when to laugh, when to reassure, when to change the subject, and when to make herself smaller so no one else felt uncomfortable. Everyone recognized the woman she had learned to present, but Hannah could no longer feel the woman beneath her. Carl Jung described the persona as the social face we create to move safely through the world. It helps us belong, work, communicate, and meet expectations. But when the persona becomes more familiar than the inner life it was meant to protect, a person may begin to feel like a guest inside her own personality. That was what Hannah felt at the table. Nothing terrible had happened. No one had rejected her. The room was friendly, the food was warm, and her phone continued lighting up with messages from people who cared about her. And yet she had never felt farther from herself. Someone across the table asked whether she was all right. Hannah almost gave the answer everyone expected. She almost smiled and said she was simply tired. Instead, she paused. The silence lasted only a few seconds, but within it she felt the weight of thousands of moments when she had explained herself before knowing what she truly felt. She said she needed to leave early. She did not invent an excuse. She did not promise to make it up to anyone. She collected her coat, stepped outside, and allowed the cold rain to touch her face. In the car, her phone began to vibrate. Messages arrived asking whether something was wrong. Hannah watched the screen without responding. For the first time, she did not feel responsible for immediately repairing the uncertainty her departure had created. She turned off the notifications and drove home through wet streets reflecting red and gold traffic lights. This was not an act of punishment. She was not trying to make anyone miss her. Something deeper had simply reached its limit. The part of her that had spent years maintaining every connection, explaining every silence, and protecting every impression could no longer continue without costing her the life beneath it. When Hannah entered her quiet house, the absence of noise felt almost frightening. She placed her phone face down on the kitchen counter and stood alone in the dim room. Without the voices of other people, she could hear how exhausted she had become from always being recognizable. But the mask she wore had not formed in a single evening, and removing it would reveal more than peace. It would reveal the woman who had been waiting beneath thousands of careful reactions, hoping Hannah would finally become quiet enough to notice her. By Monday morning, Hannah had returned to the classroom, but the quiet from Saturday night had followed her. She greeted students, discussed a novel, and answered questions with the same patience everyone expected, yet she noticed how often her attention moved away from her own experience and toward the faces around her. Before expressing an opinion, she checked whether the room was ready to receive it. Before setting a limit, she imagined how disappointed someone might become. Before allowing herself to feel tired, she measured how much other people still needed from her. Hannah had spent years believing this sensitivity was simply part of her nature, but she was beginning to see that much of her personality had been shaped through the eyes of others. She had learned to become whatever made connection easier. Around anxious people, she became reassuring. Around demanding people, she became flexible. Around emotionally distant people, she became more attentive. Around anyone who seemed disappointed, she became responsible. Over time, these adjustments no longer felt like choices. They became the structure of her identity. Carl Jung understood that the persona begins as an adaptation. It helps a person participate in society, fulfill responsibilities, and belong to a group. But when a person repeatedly receives love, praise, or safety only for being useful, agreeable, or composed, the persona can become a silent contract. Hannah had lived by that contract for most of her adult life. She would remain easy to understand, and in return, others would continue to value her. She would carry the emotional weight, and in return, no one would accuse her of being selfish. She would make herself predictable, and in return, She would not have to face the fear of exclusion. This was why people described Hannah as steady. They could trust her to answer, to listen, to stay calm, and to make room. But very few people had ever been asked to make room for her. Even Hannah did not know what she wanted when no one else was present to influence the answer. That afternoon, a colleague stopped her in the hallway and asked whether she could organize another school event. Hannah felt the familiar yes rise before she had considered the request. She could already see the relief on the other woman's face. She could also feel the heaviness in her own chest. For once, she did not answer immediately. She said she needed time to think. The colleague looked surprised, and Hannah felt a wave of guilt, as though a few seconds of uncertainty had made her unreliable. But beneath the guilt was a quieter realization. The old version of her had been so recognizable because she was always available on demand. That evening, Hannah sat alone at her dining table and wrote a question at the top of a blank page. Who am I when no one is watching for the version they expect? She stared at the sentence for a long time. No answer came. Without the reflection of other people's approval, her identity felt strangely unfinished. Yet perhaps it was not unfinished. Perhaps it had simply never been allowed to develop from the inside outward. The silence ahead would not immediately tell Hannah who she was. First, it would remove the borrowed voices that had been answering for her. Over the next 2 weeks, Hannah began removing small pieces of noise from her life, and the absence felt less like freedom than withdrawal. She still taught every weekday, graded papers, bought groceries, and answered the messages that involved real responsibilities. She did not disappear from work, abandon her family, or cut herself off from the people who genuinely cared for her. What changed was quieter. She declined 2 social invitations that she would once have accepted out of guilt. She stopped checking her phone after 9 o'clock at night. She walked home from school without filling the 40-minute route with podcasts, calls, or music. She no longer shared every plan before she had enough time to understand whether the plan belonged to her. At first, these choices created an emptiness she did not know how to inhabit. Her hand reached for the phone before she consciously decided to pick it up. Silence in the house made ordinary sounds feel unusually loud. Rain against the windows, the refrigerator turning on, the floor settling beneath her feet. Without constant conversation, Hannah began to wonder whether she was becoming distant, selfish, or emotionally unavailable. A close friend sent a message asking why she had been so quiet lately. Hannah typed a long explanation, erased it, wrote another, and erased that one too. She finally answered that she was taking more time for herself and would reach out when she had the energy to be fully present. The message looked almost too simple. She stared at it for several minutes before sending it, as though a short answer might be interpreted as a moral failure. This was the difficulty no one usually mentions about solitude. When a person has spent years receiving reassurance through usefulness and availability, quiet does not immediately feel peaceful. It can feel like the removal of an identity. Carl Jung understood that consciousness often depends on familiar social reflections. Other people show us the version of ourselves they have learned to expect, and when those reflections disappear, the ego may experience the blank space as danger. Hannah had believed she knew herself because she knew how to respond to everyone around her. Now, without those constant invitations to perform, she felt uncertain about what remained. One Friday evening, she sat in the living room with no plans and no one waiting for an answer. The discomfort grew so strong that she nearly called someone simply to escape it. Instead, she stayed. She watched the rain move down the glass and allowed the restlessness to exist without turning it into action. Slowly, she noticed that the emptiness was not truly empty. Beneath the urge to connect was fatigue. Beneath the fatigue was sadness. Beneath the sadness was a question she had postponed for years. What had she been protecting herself from by remaining endlessly occupied with other people? The silence had not taken her life away. It had removed the sounds that prevented her from hearing where her life had gone. For the first time, Hannah understood that she was not withdrawing from humanity. She was withdrawing her energy from automatic performance. But once the performance began to fade, the inner room she had avoided did not greet her with immediate peace. It opened into emotions, desires, and resentments that had been waiting far longer than she knew. That night, Hannah dreamed of a house she had never seen before, though every room felt strangely familiar. She moved through a quiet hallway lined with framed photographs, shelves of books, and carefully arranged furniture, all of it clean, orderly, and welcoming. It looked like the life she had built for others to enter. Yet at the end of the hall, beneath a narrow staircase, there was a locked door she had somehow avoided for years. When Hannah touched the handle, she felt the same discomfort that had followed her through the silent evenings. She wanted to turn away, but the door opened. A staircase descended into a room below the house, dim but not frightening, filled with objects she recognized without understanding how they had arrived there. On one table sat unfinished pages from a book she had once wanted to write. In a corner rested invitations she had accepted when she wanted to say no. Along the wall were small boxes marked with words she rarely allowed herself to use: anger, envy, loneliness, disappointment, desire. Hannah woke before sunrise with the feeling that she had visited a real place inside herself. Jung believed the unconscious often communicates through images because some truths cannot enter consciousness through logic alone. The hidden room in Hannah's dream was not a warning of something evil beneath her personality. It was an image of the shadow, the collection of feelings, instincts, and unlived possibilities that had been pushed aside because they did not fit the person she believed she needed to be. Over the next several days, the contents of that room began appearing in ordinary moments. Hannah felt anger when a friend assumed she would rearrange her schedule without asking. She noticed envy when she read about a former classmate who had published a novel. She felt resentment toward people who praised her generosity while rarely wondering what it cost her. She grieved the years she had spent telling herself that writing was impractical, that her private ambitions could wait, that being useful was more responsible than being alive. These emotions unsettled her because they challenged the image of the calm, generous woman everyone knew. But the more honestly she observed them, the less dangerous they became. Her anger was not asking her to become cruel. It was showing her where she had been overextended. Her envy was not proof of smallness. It pointed toward a life she still longed to create. Her resentment revealed the places where giving had become a substitute for choosing. Even her loneliness carried a message. It was not only the absence of company. It was the ache of having remained unseen while constantly making others feel understood. Hannah began to realize that she had not stepped away from people because she no longer cared. She had stepped away because she had spent years stepping away from herself. The deeper disappearance had happened gradually. Each time she ignored a desire, softened a truth, or abandoned an inner signal to preserve an outer role. Now the silence was reversing that movement. It was bringing her back into the room beneath the room, where nothing had been destroyed, only postponed. But recognizing the hidden parts of herself would not be enough. The energy trapped inside them had to be reclaimed, and that would require Hannah to stop feeding the habits that had kept the door closed. Hannah began reclaiming her energy in ways so ordinary that no one around her would have called them transformation. She stopped beginning each morning with messages and gave the first hour of the day to silence. Before school, she sat at the small desk beside her living room window and wrote whatever came without asking whether it was useful, impressive, or ready to be seen. At first, only fragments appeared: a memory from childhood, a sentence about rain, a woman standing in a locked library. But the pages slowly became a path back toward the part of her that had once wanted to create without permission. After teaching, Hannah walked several miles through the damp Portland streets instead of calling someone to process every detail of the day. She noticed how often she had used conversation to avoid hearing her own conclusions. She had asked for opinions before trusting her instincts, shared plans before they had taken root, and explained choices that had not required anyone else's approval. Each habit had seemed harmless, but together they had scattered her attention in every direction. Jung described psychic energy as something that can become invested in roles, relationships, fears, and unconscious conflicts. Hannah began to see how much of hers had been spent monitoring reactions. She anticipated disappointment before anyone expressed it. She revised her words to prevent misunderstanding. She carried imagined conversations into the night and woke already preparing for demands that had not yet arrived. Reclaiming that energy did not mean caring less. It meant ending the constant inner labor of managing every possible response. She turned the unused guest room into a modest writing space, moving a chair beside the window and filling one shelf with books she had loved before responsibility became the center of her identity. She also began meeting with a therapist every other Thursday. Hannah did not want solitude to become another mask, one that allowed her to avoid intimacy while calling it growth. In those sessions, she learned to distinguish the peace of chosen silence from the numbness of emotional withdrawal. She remained connected to one trusted friend, meeting her for coffee without performing strength or offering solutions. For the first time, Hannah allowed herself to be uncertain in another person's presence. Something changed as her energy stopped leaking into constant explanation. She did not immediately feel more powerful. She felt more precise. She noticed which invitations brought warmth and which brought heaviness. She sensed when a yes came from generosity and when it came from fear. Her prayers changed as well. She no longer asked for a perfect sign or immediate direction. She asked for the courage to recognize what was already true. The answer often arrived not as a voice, but as a quiet expansion when something aligned and a familiar contraction when she was about to abandon herself again. By early winter, Hannah had written 30 pages of a manuscript she had postponed for more than a decade. She told almost no one. The work felt alive because it had not yet been exposed to the expectations of the room. Her disappearance was no longer an absence. It had become a retrieval. Every unnecessary explanation she withheld, every morning she protected, and every honest sentence she placed on the page returned a small portion of her life to its center. But reclaimed energy eventually asks to be given form, and Hannah was approaching a decision that would reveal whether her new inner clarity could survive the disappointment of people who still depended on the woman she had been. The decision arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, hidden inside an ordinary staff meeting. The principal announced that the school needed someone to lead the spring literacy committee, and before he finished speaking, several people turned toward Hannah. For years, this was how responsibilities found her. No one had to ask whether she had the time. Her reliability had become a public resource. The old Hannah would have smiled, accepted, and spent the evening rearranging her life around another obligation. But this time, she felt the familiar heaviness in her chest and did not mistake it for selfishness. She thought of the manuscript waiting on her desk, the 30 pages she had written before sunrise, and the part of herself that had only recently begun to trust that its desires deserved protection. When the principal asked directly, Hannah said she would not be able to lead the committee that year. The room became still for only a moment, but to Hannah it felt like standing outside every expectation that had once defined her. A colleague beside her looked surprised and asked whether something was wrong. Hannah almost began explaining. She could feel the old sentences gathering in her mind, ready to prove that she was still responsible, still generous, still worthy of their respect. Instead, she said she was making room for an important personal commitment. The answer was clear, but it offered no details for anyone to evaluate. After the meeting, one teacher followed her into the hallway and said she did not seem like herself lately. The comment was not openly unkind, yet it carried the weight of an invitation to return to the woman everyone knew how to use. Hannah smiled gently and said that perhaps she was becoming more honest about what she could carry. Then she walked away before guilt could turn the conversation into a confession. That evening, she opened her laptop and completed an application for a summer writing program in Washington State. The form asked for a sample of her work and a statement about why the project mattered. Hannah stared at the blank space for several minutes. In the past, she would have written what sounded impressive or reasonable. This time, she wrote the truth. She said she had spent years helping other people find language for their lives while postponing the language of her own. She said the manuscript was not an escape from teaching, family, or responsibility. It was an attempt to live from a deeper center rather than from the role she had learned to perform. When she pressed submit, no music played, no sign appeared, and no one called to tell her she had made the right choice. The room remained quiet. Yet, Hannah felt something settle within her. Jung believed that alignment with the self often begins when a person accepts the tension between belonging and becoming. To become more whole, Hannah could not continue receiving approval from every system built around her predictability. The old version of her had been easy to recognize because she rarely interrupted what others expected. She said yes before checking inward. She made herself available before asking what her own life required. Now, for the first time, she had made a decision no one around her had approved because no one around her had been invited to authorize it. The discomfort did not disappear, but it no longer meant she was wrong. It meant she had stepped beyond the border of her old identity. And once a person stops performing the role that holds a system together, the system rarely remains silent. It begins calling the old version back. The calls back to her old life did not arrive as commands. They came disguised as concern, disappointment, and familiar need. A week after Hannah submitted the writing application, her older sister called and said the family had noticed she was becoming distant. She reminded Hannah that everyone depended on her to keep conversations from turning tense during holiday gatherings. Hannah listened quietly and felt the old reflex preparing an apology. She could have explained the therapy sessions, the mornings spent writing, the exhaustion she had hidden for years. Instead, she said she cared about the family, but she would no longer take responsibility for resolving conflicts between adults. Her sister became silent, and Hannah felt guilt move through her chest like a door trying to close. She let the silence remain. Later that week, the principal stopped her after school and asked whether she had reconsidered leading the literacy committee. He said the staff trusted her and that no one else had her ability to keep people organized. The praise touched the exact place where Hannah had once confused recognition with belonging. She thanked him, but repeated that her decision had not changed. His disappointment was polite, yet Hannah carried it into the parking lot as though she had failed someone. She sat in her car for several minutes, noticing how quickly the old persona tried to bargain. You could do both. You could sleep less. You could write later. You could prove that becoming yourself has not made you unreliable. But another voice had grown stronger. It did not argue. It simply reminded her that every life has limits, and that saying yes to everything had once required saying no to the parts of her no one else could see. The most difficult message came from an old friend named Laura, who wrote that Hannah had become hard to reach and no longer seemed interested in the people who had always supported her. Hannah read the message twice. There was truth in part of it. She had withdrawn without knowing how to describe what was happening. But beneath Laura's concern was another expectation. Hannah had always answered immediately, listened for hours, and made herself available whenever Laura felt overwhelmed. Hannah replied with care, acknowledging the distance while refusing to promise a return to constant access. Laura did not respond for several days. The silence hurt, but it also revealed something Hannah could no longer ignore. Some people missed her presence. Others missed her availability. The two were not the same. Jung understood that when one person changes inwardly, the surrounding relationships often try to restore the previous balance. A family, workplace, or friendship develops around predictable roles. When the reliable one stops carrying extra weight, the system may call her selfish. When the quiet one begins speaking honestly, others may call her difficult. When the endlessly available person creates limits, people may say she has changed. They are often correct. What they do not always understand is that the old version was maintained through an invisible cost. Hannah did not punish anyone for preferring the woman she had been. She simply stopped rebuilding that woman each time someone felt uncomfortable. She allowed misunderstanding to exist without turning it into an emergency. She continued teaching, meeting her trusted friend for coffee, attending therapy, and writing before sunrise. Her world did not collapse. It rearranged itself around the truth she was finally willing to live. Yet one final temptation remained. Hannah wanted people to see that her withdrawal had meaning. She wanted to explain the manuscript, the inner work, and the person taking shape in private. But the identity forming within her was still tender, and what was being built without witnesses would need protection from the hunger to be recognized too soon. For the next several months, Hannah resisted the urge to turn her private transformation into another performance. She did not announce that she was healing. She did not post photographs of her writing desk or explain why she had become less available. She did not tell everyone about the summer program application, even after she received an email inviting her to join. The news mattered deeply, but she allowed it to remain inside a small circle, her therapist, her trusted friend, and the quiet room where she worked before sunrise. This restraint was more difficult than she expected. Part of Hannah still wanted witnesses. She wanted people to understand that her silence was not rejection, that her boundaries were not punishment, and that the distance they felt was connected to something honest growing within her. But each time she imagined explaining everything, she noticed the old persona waiting beneath the words. It wanted to control how others interpreted her. It wanted approval for becoming different. It wanted transformation to be recognized before it had become stable. Jung understood that the ego can attach itself even to inner growth. A person may stop performing one identity only to begin performing another. Hannah could easily have replaced the image of the endlessly helpful woman with the image of the mysterious, awakened woman who had outgrown everyone around her. That would not have been freedom. It would have been another mask. So she continued the quieter work. She wrote. She revised. She attended therapy. She rested without turning rest into a moral achievement. She remained present in the few relationships that allowed honesty without constant explanation. She learned that a new identity is like an image developing in a darkroom. Expose it to too much light too soon, and the picture can be damaged before its shape has fully appeared. Her manuscript grew from 30 pages to more than 100. Some mornings the work flowed. Other mornings, every sentence felt uncertain. Hannah began to understand that becoming was not a constant feeling of progress. It was the willingness to remain devoted when no one applauded, when results were invisible, and when the old life still looked easier from a distance. There were evenings when she missed the simplicity of being predictable. The old role had been exhausting, but it had also been familiar. People knew what to ask from her. Hannah knew what response would preserve harmony. Now she had to tolerate the unfinished feeling of a life no longer organized around immediate approval. She did not always feel strong. She often felt ordinary, quiet, and unseen. Yet beneath that lack of recognition, something was becoming more solid. Her choices no longer depended on whether anyone called them wise. Her work no longer needed to be praised before it felt real. Her silence was no longer a strategy to make people curious. It had become a protected space where the self could develop without being shaped by every passing opinion. By the time spring returned to Portland, Hannah understood that the deepest transformation rarely happens in public. It happens in rooms where no one is watching, in decisions no one celebrates, and in the repeated refusal to abandon what is true simply because the old world has not yet learned how to recognize it. Soon, however, she would have to step back into a crowded room much like the one she had left months earlier, and this time the woman who entered would no longer belong to the gaze that once defined her. In late April, Hannah stood outside a small independent bookstore in downtown Portland while rain softened the reflections along the sidewalk. Inside, rows of folding chairs faced a narrow wooden podium where local teachers and writers had gathered to read from their work. The room was crowded in a way that reminded her of the birthday dinner months earlier, but the similarity ended there. This time, Hannah did not scan the faces to determine what version of herself the room required. She did not rehearse a warmer smile, adjust her voice to seem more agreeable, or measure whether her presence made anyone else comfortable. She entered quietly, greeted the people she knew, and allowed herself to remain exactly where she was inside. Several colleagues from school were there. Laura stood near the back with a cup of coffee and gave Hannah a cautious smile. The principal nodded from across the room. Her sister had come as well, though their relationship was still learning a new shape. Hannah felt the old awareness of being watched, but it no longer reached as deeply. The gaze of others had not disappeared. It had simply stopped functioning as the center of her identity. When her name was called, Hannah walked to the podium with a printed page in her hand. The manuscript she had once hidden in the quietest room of her house now existed as something real enough to share. Yet even in that moment, she did not feel as though she were presenting a new self for approval. She was offering a piece of work that had grown from the life she had finally stopped abandoning. Her voice trembled slightly during the first sentence, then settled. She read about a woman who had spent years keeping every room peaceful until she discovered a locked library beneath her own home. The audience became still. Hannah did not rush to fill that stillness. She trusted the words to stand without explanation. When she finished, the applause was warm but brief, and she returned to her seat without searching every face for evidence that she had been understood correctly. This was the difference she could not have explained months earlier. She still cared how her work touched people, but their response no longer decided whether the work was true. After the reading, several people approached her. One teacher said she had never known Hannah wanted to write. Another asked why she had kept it private for so long. Hannah answered simply that some things needed time before they could survive being seen. Then Laura stepped forward. For a moment, neither woman spoke. Laura said Hannah seemed different, not in an accusing way, but with the uncertainty of someone meeting a familiar person whose old patterns were no longer available. Hannah smiled. She did not deny it. She did not explain the therapy, the mornings before sunrise, the loneliness, the pages, or the boundaries that had reshaped her life. She only said that she felt more like herself than she had in years. Laura looked at her for a long moment, then said she could see that. The conversation did not solve everything between them, but it did not need to. Hannah had learned that real connection could tolerate unfinished understanding. Her sister approached next and admitted that the family had relied on Hannah more than they realized. There was no dramatic apology, only a small moment of honesty. Hannah received it without rushing to reassure her. She no longer softened every truth before allowing it to land. Across the room, the principal asked whether the summer writing program meant she planned to leave teaching. Hannah said she did not know yet. The uncertainty once would have embarrassed her. Now it felt honest. She had spent too much of her life offering complete answers before her inner life had finished speaking. Outside the bookstore, the rain had stopped. Evening light moved between the buildings, and the air smelled like wet pavement and spring leaves. Hannah walked toward her car alone, but she did not feel isolated. The solitude surrounding her was no longer an empty room. It had become a place of belonging within herself. She thought about the woman who had left the birthday dinner months earlier, frightened by the silence that followed her home. That woman had believed disappearing meant losing connection, losing relevance, perhaps even losing love. But what had actually disappeared was the system of reflexes that had kept her recognizable. The immediate yes, the endless explanation, the smile used to hide discomfort, the panic that followed misunderstanding, the belief that goodness required constant access. None of those responses were gone because Hannah had become cold. They were gone because they were no longer necessary for her to survive. Jung believed that individuation asks a person to become more fully who they are, even when that movement disrupts the image others have learned to trust. Hannah had not become unrecognizable because she had changed her face, abandoned her responsibilities, or rejected the people around her. She had become unrecognizable because the old ways of controlling her no longer reached the woman she had become. Guilt could still visit, but it could not command her. Disappointment could still hurt, but it could not define her. Silence could still feel lonely, but it no longer frightened her back into performance. She remained a teacher, a sister, a friend, and a woman capable of deep care. Yet she no longer lived through those roles as if they were the whole of her. The persona had returned to its proper place, not as a prison, but as a useful face through which a deeper self could meet the world. Hannah reached her car and looked back at the bookstore window. Through the glass, she could see the room where people were still talking, laughing, and gathering their coats. Months earlier, she would have wondered whether she should go back inside to make sure everyone felt included. Instead, she opened the car door and felt no guilt for leaving when she was ready. Her life had not become smaller through silence. It had become more exact. She had fewer explanations, fewer automatic obligations, and fewer relationships built on access without reciprocity. But she had more presence, more truth, and more room for the work that made her feel alive. The woman everyone once recognized had not vanished completely. She had simply stopped being the only woman allowed to exist. Hannah drove home through the soft evening light, not as someone who had escaped the world, but as someone who could finally enter it without leaving herself behind.